Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for more than a decade and believed he had developed the ability to anticipate almost any response a contestant might give. But on a bright September afternoon in 2024, he was about to hear an answer so unexpected and profound that he would cover his face with both hands and stand motionless while the studio audience sat in absolute silence, struggling to comprehend the weight of what they had just witnessed. The atmosphere in the studio carried the familiar energy of a game show taping, with two families positioned on stage, ready to compete for prize money, cameras recording what everyone anticipated would be another entertaining episode filled with laughter and perhaps a few heartwarming moments. What nobody could have predicted was that a 93-year-old woman was about to give a fast money answer that would transcend the boundaries of game show entertainment and become instead a window into one of the darkest chapters of human history and the lifelong impact of surviving the unsurvivable. Before we continue with this extraordinary account, if you value stories that remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of remembering history through the voices of those who lived it, please take a moment to press that like button and subscribe to our channel, because what you are about to hear represents a piece of living history that deserves to be preserved and shared. The Hamilton family from New York stood on one side of the stage, their matching crimson shirts displaying their family name with obvious pride, their expressions reflecting the enthusiasm and competitive spirit typical of Family Feud contestants. On the opposite side stood the Rosenberg family from Florida, equally prepared and displaying the kind of multi-generational cohesion that makes the show particularly compelling. Among the Rosenberg family members stood someone who immediately commanded attention, not through any dramatic gesture, but through the sheer fact of her presence and the unmistakable aura of someone who had witnessed nearly a century of human history. Sarah Rosenberg was 93 years old, standing with remarkable steadiness despite her advanced age, her posture still relatively straight, and her blue eyes retaining a clarity and intensity that suggested a mind still sharp and fully engaged despite the passage of so many decades. She wore an elegant purple blouse with a simple gold chain at her throat, an outfit her granddaughter had helped her select, and on her left forearm, barely visible beneath her sleeve, was the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo, unusual for a woman of her generation. Sarah had been born in 1931 in Warsaw, Poland, the youngest of 3 children in a Jewish family that had lived in that city for generations. Her father had been a physician, her mother a music teacher, and their home had been filled with books, music, intellectual conversation, and the kind of cultural richness that characterized educated Jewish families in pre-war Poland. Sarah's early childhood had been marked by comfort, security, and the normal joys and challenges of growing up in a loving family in a vibrant city. She had been a bright child who loved reading, showed talent for mathematics, and had been particularly close to her older brother David, who had patiently taught her chess and shared his books with her. Her family had been observant Jews who maintained their religious traditions while also being fully engaged with the broader Polish society, contributing to the cultural and professional life of Warsaw. Everything had changed in September of 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, beginning World War II and unleashing a campaign of destruction that would ultimately claim 6 million Jewish lives in what would become known as the Holocaust. Sarah had been 8 years old when the war began, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, but too young to comprehend the full scope of the catastrophe that was unfolding. Her family had been forced into the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940, crammed with hundreds of thousands of other Jews into a sealed section of the city where disease, starvation, and random violence became daily realities. Sarah's father had continued to practice medicine in the ghetto, treating people with almost no supplies or resources, and her mother had traded family possessions for food to keep her children alive as rations dwindled and conditions deteriorated. In 1942, when Sarah was 11 years old, the Nazis began liquidating the Warsaw Ghetto, transporting Jews to Treblinka extermination camp where they were murdered in gas chambers upon arrival. Sarah's parents, recognizing that deportation meant death, had made the desperate decision to try to save at least one of their children by arranging for Sarah to be smuggled out of the ghetto and hidden by a Polish Catholic family who had agreed to take the enormous risk of harboring a Jewish child. The plan had been discovered before it could be executed. And in the chaos that followed, Sarah had been separated from her family and had witnessed her mother being shot by a Nazi guard while trying to protect Sarah's older brother. Sarah herself had been grabbed by a neighbor who had dragged her into hiding in a cellar before the guards could notice her, and she had remained hidden in that cellar for 3 days, traumatized and alone, before being found by members of the Jewish resistance who had been preparing for armed uprising against the Nazis. Sarah had spent the next several months living in the hidden bunkers and tunnels of the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, a child among adults who were preparing to fight knowing they would almost certainly die but preferring to resist rather than submit passively to extermination. She had been present during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April of 1943, when the remaining Jews fought against Nazi forces for nearly a month before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and weaponry. Sarah had survived the destruction of the ghetto by hiding in the sewers beneath the city, part of a small group that had escaped through underground passages while the ghetto burned above them. She had eventually been smuggled out of Warsaw and hidden by a series of Catholic families and convents that risked their lives to protect Jewish children, moving from place to place whenever discovery seemed imminent, living under false identity papers that identified her as a Catholic orphan named Maria Kowalska. Sarah had survived the war, but her entire family had been murdered. Her father had been shot during the liquidation of the ghetto. Her mother had been killed protecting her brother, as Sarah had witnessed. Her brother David and her older sister had both been transported to Treblinka and murdered in the gas chambers. Her grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins had all perished in various concentration camps and ghettos. Sarah had emerged from the war at age 14 as the sole survivor of a family that had once numbered more than 30 people, carrying trauma that would mark her for the rest of her life, and memories that she would struggle to process and integrate. After the war ended in 1945, Sarah had lived for 2 years in a displaced persons camp, waiting while Jewish organizations tried to locate any surviving relatives and determine what would happen to the thousands of orphan Jewish children who had survived the Holocaust. No relatives had been found, and in 1947, Sarah had been among a group of Jewish orphans brought to the United States under a special program designed to resettle Holocaust survivors. She had arrived in New York at age 16, speaking limited English, carrying enormous trauma, and facing the task of building an entirely new life in a country she had never seen. Sarah had been placed with a foster family, had learned English, had completed high school while working part-time jobs to support herself, and had eventually attended City College of New York on a scholarship. She had studied mathematics, the subject that had always come easily to her and that had provided mental escape during the worst periods of the war and its aftermath. She had met Jacob Rosenberg in 1952, a young man who had also survived the Holocaust, having spent 3 years in Auschwitz concentration camp after his family had been deported from Hungary. They had married in 1953, 2 survivors building a life together, understanding each other's trauma in ways that nobody who had not experienced the Holocaust could possibly comprehend. Sarah and Jacob had settled in Brooklyn, where Jacob worked as a tailor and Sarah worked first as a bookkeeper and later as a mathematics teacher at a public high school. They had built a modest but stable middle-class life, and they had raised 3 children whom they had been determined to give the security and normalcy that had been stolen from them during their own childhoods. Sarah had been a devoted mother who had created a home filled with love, education, Jewish traditions maintained despite the trauma of the Holocaust, and an insistence on speaking about what had happened rather than burying it in silence. She had told her children age-appropriate versions of her story as they grew up, had taken them to Holocaust museums and memorials, and had emphasized the importance of remembering and bearing witness so that such atrocities could never be repeated or denied. Jacob had died in 2008 at age 81, his health finally failing after decades of dealing with both physical and psychological damage from his time in Auschwitz. Sarah had been widowed for 16 years now, and she had continued to live independently in the same Brooklyn apartment where she and Jacob had raised their family, supported by her children and grandchildren, but maintaining her autonomy and engagement with life despite her advanced age. She had become more active in Holocaust education in her later years, speaking at schools and community organizations about her experiences, participating in oral history projects designed to preserve survivor testimony before the last living witnesses of the Holocaust passed away, and emphasizing to young people the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and the dehumanization of others. Sarah had been reluctant when her grandchildren first suggested applying for Family Feud, feeling that a game show seemed frivolous and perhaps inappropriate for someone of her age and background. But her grandchildren had persisted, arguing that creating happy family memories was important and that Sarah deserved to experience joy and fun rather than spending her final years focused only on grief and remembrance. Sarah had eventually agreed, partly because she loved her grandchildren and wanted to make them happy, and partly because she had come to believe that survivors of the Holocaust had a responsibility to show that Hitler had not succeeded in his goal of destroying the Jewish people, that survivors had built lives and families and had found meaning and even joy despite unimaginable loss and trauma. Now, standing on the Family Feud stage at 93 years old, with her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren surrounding her, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was genuine pleasure in being part of this family experience and in seeing her descendants gathered together in celebration. There was also the constant underlying current of grief and memory that never fully left her, the awareness that her parents and siblings should have been here to see this multi-generational family that had emerged from the sole survivor of their murdered family. She touched the gold chain at her throat, a habit developed over decades, and she prepared herself to participate in this unfamiliar but clearly meaningful experience. Steve Harvey began his introduction of the families with characteristic warmth and energy, clearly delighted by the multi-generational nature of both competing families. When he reached Sarah, Steve paused with obvious respect and gentle curiosity, taking in the elderly woman who was clearly the matriarch of the Rosenberg family. He asked Sarah her age, and when she replied that she was 93 years old, the audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and several people called out words of admiration. Steve commented on how wonderful it was to see someone of Sarah's age looking so sharp and engaged, and he asked her what the secret to longevity was. Sarah smiled, a warm expression that somehow also held sadness, and she replied that the secret to a long life was surviving when you were supposed to die, and then deciding that you owed it to those who did not survive to live fully and find meaning despite everything that had been taken from you. The answer was more serious and complex than the typical responses Steve received to this question, and his expression shifted to something more thoughtful and respectful. He asked Sarah to tell him about her family, and Sarah introduced her children and grandchildren with obvious love and pride, describing their various accomplishments and the lives they had built. Steve asked about Sarah's late husband, and Sarah's face softened as she spoke about Jacob, explaining that they had both survived the Holocaust and had built a life together based on shared understanding of trauma and shared determination to create beauty and meaning in a world that had shown them its darkest possibilities. The mood in the studio shifted perceptibly as Sarah spoke these words, the casual game show atmosphere giving way to something more serious and respectful, as people absorbed the information that this elderly woman was a Holocaust survivor. Steve's expression reflected deep respect and emotion, and he thanked Sarah for sharing that information and for being willing to participate in something fun and lighthearted despite carrying such heavy history. Sarah told him that her grandchildren had convinced her to come, and that after surviving the Holocaust, she had learned that you should embrace opportunities for joy and connection because life was precious and uncertain. The game began, and both families competed with enthusiasm and good humor. Sarah participated when it was her turn, displaying mental sharpness that impressed everyone present, and her family members kept glancing at her with obvious affection and pride. The competition was close and engaging, with both families performing well and the lead changing several times. The Rosenberg family ultimately prevailed in the main game by accumulating more total points, and they advanced to the fast money round for an opportunity to win the $20,000 grand prize. Sarah's grandson volunteered to go first, handling the rapid-fire questions with composure and scoring 138 points. A solid performance that meant the second family member needed 62 points to reach the 200-point threshold and secure the prize. The family began discussing who should take the second position, And Sarah surprised everyone by stating quietly but firmly that she wanted to do it, that she had come to participate fully and not to stand on the sidelines, and that her grandchildren should trust that at 93 years old she still had sufficient mental agility to handle 5 questions in 20 seconds. Her children looked uncertain, worried about the pressure on their elderly mother. But Sarah's expression made clear this was not negotiable. She made her way to the Fast Money podium with careful but steady steps, her bearing dignified despite her obvious physical fragility. Steve Harvey approached Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern, asking if she was certain she wanted to take on this challenge and gently reminding her that the Fast Money round required quick thinking under pressure. Sarah looked directly at Steve with those clear blue eyes and told him that she had survived things far more stressful than answering questions on a game show, and that she was quite certain she could handle 20 seconds of mental challenge. Steve nodded with obvious respect and announced that 20 seconds would go on the clock. The familiar timer appeared on the screen, and Steve began asking questions. Name something people are afraid of. Heights, Sarah answered immediately. Name a place where people wait in line. Supermarket, she responded without hesitation. Name something you might do on a first date. Talk, Sarah said clearly. Name a reason you might be late to work. Traffic. Steve moved to the 5th and final question, asking Sarah to name something you take with you when you travel. Sarah stood silent for a long moment, longer than the typical pause between questions in Fast Money, and her expression changed to something distant and deeply sad. Steve waited, clearly sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Finally, just before the buzzer would have sounded, Sarah spoke a single word. Memories. The answer seemed odd. Not the typical concrete response like suitcase or clothes that contestants usually gave to such questions. But before Steve could react or move to reveal Sarah's answers, she continued speaking, her voice stronger now and filled with emotion. She said she needed to explain that answer, needed the audience to understand why she had said memories when asked what you take with you when you travel. She said that in 1942, when she was 11 years old, she had been forced to travel from her home to the Warsaw Ghetto, carrying only what she could hold in her small hands, and that the only things she had been able to take that mattered were her memories of her family, her home, and the life that was being destroyed. Sarah's voice grew stronger and more urgent as she continued. She explained that throughout the Holocaust, as she was moved from ghetto to hiding place, never staying anywhere long enough to accumulate possessions, living always under threat of discovery and death, the only constant she carried with her were her memories. Memories of her mother's voice singing lullabies, of her father reading to her, of her brother teaching her chess, of Friday night Shabbat dinners when her family had gathered in peace and love. She said those memories had sustained her through the sewers beneath burning Warsaw, through months of hiding in attics and cellars, through the terror of living under false identity, knowing that discovery meant death. Sarah explained that even now, at 93 years old, when she traveled anywhere, even something as simple as taking a taxi to visit her children, she carried with her the memories of everyone she had lost, everyone who had been murdered, everyone who should have been here to see the family that had emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust. She said that for survivors, the question of what you take with you when you travel could never be answered with something as simple as luggage or clothes, because survivors carried the weight of memory and responsibility to bear witness wherever they went. The studio was completely silent, every person present transfixed by Sarah's words. Steve Harvey had covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to maintain composure, tears visible on his face when he finally lowered his hands. The audience sat motionless, many people openly crying, the casual entertainment atmosphere completely transformed by the weight of Sarah's testimony. Sarah herself stood quietly at the podium, having finally said something she had carried for decades, the truth that even the simplest questions could never be simple for those who had survived the Holocaust, because every aspect of life was colored by loss and memory. When Steve finally found his voice, it emerged rough and broken, barely above a whisper. He told Sarah that what she had just shared was the most profound answer he had ever heard on Family Feud or any other show he had hosted, that her words had transformed a game show question into a moment of genuine historical witness and moral education, and that everyone present had been given an extraordinary gift by hearing her speak this truth. He turned to address the cameras directly, telling the audience watching at home that they needed to understand they had just witnessed something far more important than entertainment, that Sarah's answer represented the living testimony of someone who had survived one of the darkest chapters in human history, and who carried the memories of those who had not survived. Steve announced that he could not simply continue with the normal game show format after what Sarah had shared. He said that her answer of memories would stand regardless of whether it appeared on the survey board, because some answers transcended the mechanics of a game and needed to be honored for their deeper truth. He asked the producers to reveal Sarah's other 4 answers, and they showed as strong responses, scoring a combined total of 71 points, which when added to her grandson's score brought the family total to 209 points. The Rosenberg family had won the $20,000, but the victory felt almost incidental compared to the profound moment that had just occurred. Steve then did something unprecedented in Family Feud history. He announced that he would personally donate $1 million to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Sarah's name to ensure that the memories she carried and the testimony she provided would be preserved and shared with future generations who would not have the opportunity to hear directly from survivors. He said that Sarah had reminded everyone that remembering was not just about looking backward, but about carrying forward the stories and the lessons so that such atrocities could never happen again. The audience erupted in applause, standing to honor both Sarah's testimony and Steve's response, the standing ovation continuing for several minutes while Sarah stood quietly accepting the recognition with dignity and grace. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate, overwhelming, and deeply emotional. The clip of Sarah's answer and Steve's reaction went viral within hours, viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. Holocaust museums and educational organizations reported enormous increases in visits and engagement as people who had watched the Family Feud clip sought to learn more about the history Sarah represented. Teachers began using the clip in their classrooms to help students understand the Holocaust through the voice of an actual survivor. Sarah's testimony became one of the most widely shared pieces of Holocaust survivor video in recent years, reaching audiences who might never visit a museum or watch a documentary, but who encountered her words through social media and the unexpected vehicle of a game show. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum announced that Steve Harvey's donation would be used to establish the Sarah Rosenberg Digital Archive, a comprehensive project to record and preserve the testimony of remaining Holocaust survivors before they passed away. The project would make these testimonies freely available to educators, researchers, and the general public, ensuring that future generations would have access to first-person accounts of the Holocaust even after the last survivors were gone. Sarah agreed to participate in an extended interview for the archive, spending more than 20 hours over several sessions providing detailed testimony about her experiences before, during, and after the Holocaust, creating a permanent record that would outlive her and continue bearing witness. Media outlets around the world covered Sarah's Family Feud appearance, with major newspapers and television programs discussing how her simple answer of memories had created one of the most powerful moments in recent television history. Holocaust scholars and ethicists wrote essays analyzing the significance of her testimony, appearing in such an unexpected context, arguing that reaching people through popular entertainment might be more effective at combating Holocaust denial and ensuring continued remembrance than traditional educational approaches alone. Sarah herself gave numerous interviews in the months following the broadcast, speaking about her experiences and emphasizing the importance of remembering and teaching about the Holocaust to combat rising anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and prejudice. Sarah received thousands of letters and messages from people around the world who had been moved by her Family Feud appearance, many sharing their own family stories of survival or loss during the Holocaust, others expressing gratitude for her willingness to speak difficult truths, and still others describing how her testimony had changed their understanding of history and their sense of responsibility to fight against hatred and injustice in their own time. Sarah responded personally to as many of these messages as she could, understanding that each person who reached out represented an opportunity to extend the impact of her testimony and to fulfill the obligation she felt to honor the memory of those who had not survived. The Rosenberg family used the $20,000 they won on Family Feud to establish a scholarship fund for descendants of Holocaust survivors, providing educational opportunities that honored the value Sarah's parents had placed on learning and that created something positive from the terrible losses their family had endured. Sarah's children and grandchildren became more actively involved in Holocaust education and remembrance activities. Inspired by their mother and grandmother's courage in speaking publicly about experiences she had carried for so long, Sarah lived for 18 more months after her Family Feud appearance, passing away peacefully at age 94, surrounded by her family in the Brooklyn apartment she had called home for more than 70 years. At her funeral, the rabbi spoke about Sarah's life as a testament to resilience, to the refusal to let hatred triumph, and to the importance of bearing witness even when doing so meant carrying unbearable pain. He emphasized that Sarah had survived the Holocaust, not just physically but spiritually, maintaining her humanity and her commitment to creating meaning and beauty despite everything she had lost. Her Family Feud appearance was remembered as one of her final acts of witness, a moment when she had used an unexpected platform to ensure that the memories she carried would continue to be shared and preserved. The clip of Sarah's answer continued to circulate widely after her death, becoming one of those rare pieces of content that maintained its power and relevance rather than fading from public consciousness. It was shown in schools, referenced in sermons and speeches, included in Holocaust education curricula, and shared during Holocaust Remembrance Day commemorations. Steve Harvey spoke about Sarah frequently in interviews, describing her as one of the most remarkable people he had ever encountered and explaining how her testimony had changed his understanding of his own platform and responsibility as someone with the ability to reach millions of people. He established an annual Steve Harvey Holocaust Education Award given to individuals or organizations doing exceptional work in Holocaust remembrance and education, with the first award presented posthumously to Sarah Rosenberg. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum completed the Sarah Rosenberg Digital Archive 3 years after her death, having interviewed more than 800 Holocaust survivors and preserving their testimonies in a comprehensive digital format accessible to anyone in the world with internet access. Sarah's own testimony became one of the most frequently accessed files in the archive, her words continuing to educate and move people long after her death. The archive included not just her extended interview but also the Family Feud clip that had introduced millions of people to her story, recognizing that this unexpected moment of testimony on a game show had reached audiences that traditional Holocaust education might never have touched. If this story of a 93-year-old Holocaust survivor who, simple answer, on Family Feud became a profound moment of historical witness has moved you or changed your understanding of the importance of preserving survivor testimony, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with students learning about the Holocaust, with teachers looking for powerful ways to help young people understand this history through the voices of those who lived it, and with anyone who needs to be reminded that the Holocaust was not ancient history but something that occurred within living memory and that the last survivors are passing away, making it urgent that we preserve their testimony and carry forward their imperative to remember and to fight against hatred in all its forms. Sarah Rosenberg taught us that survivors carry memories as tangible and heavy as any physical burden, that these memories demand to be shared and honored, and that even the simplest questions can become opportunities for witness and education when answered with complete honesty about the experiences that have shaped a life. She demonstrated that Holocaust survivors are not defined solely by their trauma, but are complete human beings who built families and lives and who deserve to be honored for their resilience and their refusal to let hatred triumph. Most importantly, Sarah showed us that bearing witness is not just about recounting terrible events, but about insisting that those events be remembered, that the victims be honored, and that future generations understand their responsibility to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Thank you for witnessing Sarah's testimony, and may we all carry forward the memories she preserved and the imperative to remember that she embodied throughout her remarkable 94 years of life.